Michael, thank you so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
What's your view on what the picture is in China at the moment, and a year after his election, how has Donald Trump affected the US-China relationship, if you like?
I think there's a great deal of concern in China, rightly so. There are very strong rumors that Wang Qishan, who is many people call the right-hand man of the president, who had to retire because of his age, has recently been reappointed to the National People's Congress, and there are rumors that he will be appointed vice president. And the reason for that is because he has very strong relationships in the US and he's highly credible in the US. And presumably it's very important to manage that US relationship. China has a current account surplus, of course, and it needs that current account surplus because China has a big problem with demand. It has insufficient domestic demand, so it has to balance that with huge amounts of investment and with the current account surplus. But because investment is, much of it is non-productive, all of that investment is causing debt to go up. So the current account surplus can be thought about as a mechanism that reduces the need to grow debt. My very rough calculations are that every forced contraction of China's current account surplus by 1% of GDP causes the required amount of debt required to meet the GDP growth target to go up by roughly 1/3. So it's a huge number, and if the US takes steps that forces a rapid contraction in the Chinese current account surplus, the only way China can balance that is with an increase in already too rapidly growing debt.
You talked there about if the US takes steps. What do you mean by that, and are there concerns about some sort of trade war, for example?
Yes, I think, basically one of the easier predictions to make after the global financial crisis is that we were going to see significant pressure on trade because we're in a world in which the most valuable resource is demand. And the way that demand is apportioned around the world, the demand is created domestically by all these different countries, and it's apportioned through the current account. So countries with current account surpluses are absorbing more of global demand than they're producing. Countries with current account deficits are the opposite. As long as debt levels were able to grow very, very quickly, then countries with current account deficits were able to counter the impact of their deficits with an increase in debt. But the global crisis was really sort of the end of the ability to increase debt very, very rapidly. So now that means that current account deficits have an employment impact. And once that happens, I think it was a pretty safe bet to say that we would see significant pressures on international trade, which, as you know, has contracted for the first time in a long, long time.
And with that environment in place, how tricky is it then to have a man like Donald Trump running the US as well?
I think people pay too much attention to Donald Trump. Remember that Bernie Sanders said exactly the same thing about trade. And this has been an issue that really became an important political issue in the 1980s, and it's never really gone away. The problem is that it is true that the American role in the global economy is to balance the excess demand or excess supply of savings. You can say that roughly there's been sort of 100 years of dollar hegemony. And during the first 50 years, that was really characterized by the two great world wars, which caused a destruction in the income and therefore in the savings of the rich countries of the world, and a huge need for rebuilding. So in that period, what people needed was savings. And it's not, I think, a coincidence that during that period, every single year, the US ran a current account surplus. The current account surplus is the flip side of a capital account deficit. The US was exporting a huge amount of savings into the rest of the world. Since roughly the 1960s, when the world was more or less rebuilt, the problem shifted. The world no longer lacked savings, it lacked demand. The way to grow was with additional demand, and it had excess savings. And I think it's not a coincidence that during that period, countries like the US with very open, deep, flexible financial markets, including Great Britain, were constantly running capital account surpluses. In other words, the excess savings ended up in those countries, and if you run a capital account surplus, you must run a current account deficit. And I would say that's why the US has run persistent current account deficits since the 1970s, because given the existing global framework, it's been forced to absorb excess savings in the rest of the world. So this has been a problem for a long time. During the Cold War, the US was willing to ignore the problem because by running large current account deficits, it was able to strengthen its relationships with its allies. But it's with the end of the Cold War, I think it was inevitable that that was going to become an increasing problem.
So in your view, this is such a long-term picture that the sort of protectionist kind of attitudes of somebody like Donald Trump can't have as much influence as we fear?
I think it was going to happen one way or the other. Donald Trump is not the first person to complain about the US current account deficit. The problem with the Trump administration, I think, is that although they are right to complain, they're focusing on the wrong side. They're focusing on the trade side, when the real problem is on the capital side. What they really should be focusing on is on the US role in absorbing excess foreign capital, because that's what drives the trade deficit.
So that's trade, but there are other big sort of global sort of events that could have an impact, such as the US implementing, say, an infrastructure building program. Describe that for me, and why do you think that could have an impact?
That's one of the few things in the world that actually is a free lunch. The US has huge infrastructure needs, which the private sector, for a whole bunch of reasons, is unwilling or unable to fund. But if the government were to fund infrastructure, I think we all agree that the US has infrastructure needs. If you spend $1 trillion on improving or building US infrastructure, you will increase the wealth of the US by more than $1 trillion. So you'll actually reduce your debt burden. If the US were to engage in a major infrastructure building spree, in that case, running a current account deficit wouldn't be a problem, because now the import of foreign capital would go into increasing investment. If it doesn't go into an increase in investment, it must force a reduction in savings, because it must balance. So the best way for the US to have a deficit would be if that deficit was caused by a massive infrastructure building spree. That would be great for the US and good for the world. But without that, we're going to see tremendous pressure on the current account deficit.
So that's the situation with the economy. What's the sort of situation with the power void? Because there has been this conversation about the fact that with Donald Trump looking more inwardly in the US, there is a sort of space for China to expand its global influence. Do you see that happening?
I think it makes sense for the US to reduce its global commitments, because there was a time when the US was roughly, after the Second World War, the US was roughly 50% of the world. And the world was in such a state that it really needed the US leadership on these issues. And the US was so big it could afford it. The US is now around 23% of the world. And I think the burden of that is much heavier given the relative size of the US economy and the relative size of the rest of the world. So I do think that there should be, it could be done much better than it is being done, but there should be a US withdrawal from some of these commitments. If it doesn't happen now, it will happen in the future. And I would argue it's better to happen now when the US still is in a position where it could manage the process than if the US were forced out of these positions 30, 40, 50 years from now. But the argument that a withdrawal of the US means an expansion of the Chinese role is not true. It doesn't have to mean that. It could also mean that there is no leadership. That would be quite bad. The whole purpose of Bretton Woods was we had no one playing that role in the 20s and 30s, and we all agreed it was a disaster. But we have to recognize that that could happen, and in fact, in my opinion, it's far more likely to happen, because the leadership role the US plays, the reason the dollar is the dominant reserve currency, et cetera, is not because the US will invade you if you don't buy dollars. It's because the US is willing to absorb all of your excess savings and run the corresponding current account deficit. If China wants to replace the US in that role, it's very simple. It should open up its capital markets and it should be willing to run large current account deficits, which it won't do. There's simply no way it'll do that. So it's not as if a US withdrawal will be matched with a Chinese expansion. A US withdrawal simply means a US withdrawal. I don't think there will be anybody to replace the US. In that case, I think the best way to do it, it's not going to happen, but the best way to do it is for us all to get together and decide what this new world must look like.
So we're here in Europe, there's thousands of delegates here in Berlin, and they're obviously interested in everything you have to say. How many conversations do you expect to have with people who are, investing money in what the global outlook is in terms of China, US, and indeed Brexit on the horizon too?
Well, I think everyone's really thinking about these. You know, for so long, the global sort of trade and capital regime worked fairly well, as long as countries like the US and the UK and the other so-called Anglo-Saxon economies always had these very open capital markets, because all of the savings imbalances in the world get resolved in the US financial markets. And as that's becoming increasingly difficult, it's not a surprise that people are more and more concerned about what the implications are. I wish I had answers. All I can do is tell you that I think it gets worse before it gets better.
So in terms of Brexit, what do you see as sort of trade deals that are going to come out of that? Do you think there will be a, say, China-UK trade deal post-Brexit?
Yeah, the problem is people think all we need are good trade deals. No, all we need is someone willing to run large current account deficits. And the UK has a deficit, and if it's willing to allow the deficit to grow, and I think the UK has a limited appetite for that, then trade deals between the UK and China could probably strengthen. We could probably see an awful lot more, because China needs those surpluses. Remember, it has very weak domestic demand, and much of that demand is non-productive investment, which is why debt is exploding. And the current account surplus is one of the ways of reducing the pressure to increase investment and to increase debt. That's really what China needs from the world. I'm not sure that's what the UK wants to give it.
Now, you're a man who looks back at a lot of history. You said you described yourself as a history nut earlier. So what would you say we can learn from history about going forward, what's going to perhaps happen in the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think we have to look very closely at the 20s and 30s period, because that was a period of tremendous imbalances. As has often been argued, the UK's withdrawal as the director of the system and the refusal of the US to step in. If we see a US withdrawal as director of the system and no one else is able to step in, and I would insist the only way for China to step in is to be willing to run the large current account deficits that the world needs it to run, then I think that's the period we have to look at. And it's a very bad period. In fact, as I said, the whole purpose of Bretton Woods was the consensus, the universal consensus, that whatever it was in the 20s and 30s, we don't want that anymore. Unfortunately, I think that's where we're going to go.
We need global leadership, and there might be a bit of a void.
We need either global leadership, which was possible when the US was 50% of the world. I think it's more difficult now that the US is 23% of the world, and there's nobody else to replace it. Or we need a coordinated system that works, with no gaming of the system.
Michael, fantastic to hear your insights. Thank you so much for sharing them with us. Thank you.